So, dear guests, we have to continue with the next program in our agenda, and that's combining of data by gatekeepers. We have three prominent voices, one from Brussels, one from London, and one from Haifa, Israel. I hope that Michal Koenig is with us. He is basically in charge in DigiConnect for the issue that we're going to discuss right now. Cristina Caffarra from London. We had the exclusive opportunity to talk to her on the first day in person in Berlin. Needless to introduce you, Cristina, always when I think of her, I'm thinking of one sentence when she said, "We are too nice in Europe, we are not doing such a things," thinking of structural separations and unbundlings. And last but not least, Michal Gal, who is professor at the University of Haifa. And maybe you remember last year we had the discussion with Oshrit Aviv. They wrote together the paper regarding the competitive advantages or disadvantages thanks to the GDPR. Is Michal with us? Not yet. Okay. Hope that she's going to join the discussion later, but maybe we can start immediately with Michal. Michal, we have basically one very, very important article, and everybody has great expectation when it comes to Article 5 DMA. DMA should stop some practices by the gatekeepers, and exactly when we think of combining of data, we immediately think of the Facebook case, who basically told the world what's going on and how the gatekeepers use data, in which way, and how it affects competition in many ways. What is the reason for this article, and what is the position of the Commission? What will be the effect of the current provision that we have in the DMA? The floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much, and good morning to everybody. Very happy to join this very pertinent event. And share my views on one of the key provisions, as you said, in the DMA, which is Article 5A on the combination of data. But at the outset, let me stress that these views are my personal ones and do not necessarily represent the views of the European Commission. Maybe I will answer to your question sort of in three steps. The first is, what is actually the objective of this provision, and we designed it. Then how it tries to pursue the objective, and then the question, which I think there will be a lot of discussion in the panel, whether it will be successful in achieving the objective. Now, on the overall objective, it is about addressing the specific data advantage that gatekeepers have with the opportunity of combining data across their various services in their ecosystems, or even beyond their ecosystems, including from third-party services, where through cookies and other mechanisms, they may also be able to collect and then combine data related to individual users. This is an advantage which you cannot be matched by third parties. It's a reason for high entry barriers in this area. And this also because the gatekeepers, due to the design of their ecosystems of various services, have very easy ways and convenient ways to transfer this information across their services, but also to bring users to sharing this data across the services, and we'll certainly come still to this question. I think we should also not forget about the second leg of the provision. The first one is about the combination. The second one is about the automatic signing in users into various services, which typically is also done with the purpose of combining data. So, for example, you create an account for a search service, and immediately you also have an email account, and the data of the two flow together. And for both, we have the same principle, which is subjecting these activities to consent. So, so really to stress that this, like the DMA in generally, this is a clear economic and competition contestability objective. So it's not about data protection in itself, because maybe different from the Facebook case, we are not looking at breaches of the GDPR. but in a way we are, if you want, reinforcing the GDPR rules in a specific scenario for gatekeepers. And I think it's also important to stress that it's for example, not about targeted advertising and questions about societal issues of surveillance of individuals, the protection of minors, or the use of sensitive data. So it really tries and wants to stay in the overall logic of the DMA when it comes to creating opportunities for contesting these services. I think it also has to be seen in the context of other data-related provisions, which are mainly in Article 6. For example, the 6A on the competitive misuse of data, if you are both a player and a operator on a platform, but you're running the platform yourself. And in particular, H and I, which are about the access and portability of data for both business users and end users. So I've seen criticism that 5A does not deal with the access to data for third parties. That is true, but other provisions do very much so. Now, how does it pursue this objective? It is not a ban. It is not a ban on these type of activities, but it seeks to empower users. It's an empowerment of users. Why? Because there can be useful cases where the combination of such data makes sense and is also convenient and useful for the users. So for example, if my contacts are used in my mail service, in Maps, in my Messenger service, yeah, so there are cases where this can make sense, and that's why we believe that an outright ban would go way over what is proportionate and needed. So it's about promoting choice, and the recital stresses that this has to be a real choice, so not a take it or leave it. What does it mean? It means that an alternative option has to be offered. So it cannot be, if you don't agree, then you don't get access to the service. No, there has to be an alternative of the service, which necessarily will have to be, to a certain extent, less personalized because the data combination does not happen. But this has to be the only delta and not another degradation of the service. And maybe also to point to a delta with the GDPR, so question, well, what is really the difference where already consent is required for data processing? I think with stressing the consent and the co-legislator made some clarifications to that extent, we nevertheless take a stance on other possibilities under the GDPR to use data and combine it. So now probably the essential question, will it be successful in achieving the objective? I stress that the core concept is the empowerment of users. So the key question is it possible to truly empower users and allow an informed and conscious choice on whether they agree to this combination or not? And here, that maybe brings me quickly to amendments that the Council and the Parliament added to this provision. So where the Council, for example, added that the consent has to be granular and in the recital stresses, again, the non-degradation of a service, and also clarified that only 3 other grounds in the GDPR, like legal processing or vital interests and tasks carried out in the public interest are possible, but not the other ones, in particular, legitimate interests or contract performance. And I think that really coincides with our objectives. And the Parliament also stressed that the choice has to be in an explicit and clear manner, and also talks about cross-using of the data. So it shows that both co-legislators are actually concerned with the question, can a real choice be done? On our side, we believe, yes, it can be done. And we have examples where when gatekeepers really give a real choice, people use this choice and it makes a difference. But of course, we cannot prescribe in detail for every core platform service how this has to be. And therefore, we have to have the principle here in the rule. And then it depends, obviously, on the individual gatekeeper services and how they are designed on giving this choice, particularly in the individual case. Now, then people argue that in that case, the provision doesn't fit into Article 5 because it's not self-executing and there is no possibility of a specification like in Article 7. But here my answer would be that there are two tools that the Commission still can use. Nobody stops us from issuing guidelines around the application of various provisions beyond the individual specification in 7, and this in particular in cases which are more of a horizontal application. And then secondly, there are also possibilities of commitment decisions. So where in the individual enforcement decision, we can accept and specify further on how the compliance should be done. So in my view, that can compensate the formal non-application of 7 to these provisions. And overall, we are convinced that it can make and should make a difference on the ground. Thanks.
Many thanks, Michal. Let's continue with Cristina. We've touched upon this issue in our talk also on the first day, but let's be focused on the current provision last amended by the Council that we have on the table. What's your opinion on this? Will it change something?
Well, good morning, everyone. Pencho, thank you again for inviting me to this, and it's my regret that I cannot be in person in Berlin as I was indeed a couple of days ago. It was very fun. Great to be on this panel. This is an important topic. Let me start again as a private sector speaker, always with disclosures. I've done it on Wednesday, but I'll do it again in case you have a different audience. I have worked adverse to Google, some against Facebook. I've done work for Apple, Amazon, Netflix, Microsoft, Uber, and others. So on this topic, I think there is, of course, as Michal alluded to, a discussion which is very lively amongst data protection experts about the adequacy of this particular provision. And I know that on Wednesday, when we had the discussion, Johnny Ryan in his keynote outlined some concerns that he has about indeed the specific wordings. Johnny was quite strongly suggesting that the way in which the article effectively speaks about providing consent in the singular may be inadequate because it does not provide for sufficient precision and granularity. The GDPR, as I understand it, requires that consent is given for each processing purpose. And the concern that has been expressed is that this particular wording can be inadequate because it does suggest that there could be ways in which a single consent can be obtained. And the spirit of giving consent for different processing purposes could be worked around and the data can be combined. But let me so to say a few words and take a step back as to why I feel so strongly about the importance of this whole area. You alluded to, of course, the Facebook decision by the Catalan and the subsequent developments that we are waiting from the courts. I want to just cast our mind back as an example of the kind of concerns that I think we should all be keeping very clearly in mind. I want to cast the mind back to the Google Fitbit case, because that, to my mind, is quite emblematic of the kind of concerns that we have and why these concerns go way beyond just advertising markets. There is a tendency to think about combination of data as something relevant just to tracking and advertising, and that is certainly something that worries me, and I'll get back to that. But the concern that many expressed at the time about that case, and I want to use it just as an example, was way beyond advertising application. The concern that was being expressed is that a dominant player with already a dominant position, very strongly held in demographic, location, information about consumers, with a complete data firehose, would be able to acquire a data stream of health information and combining that health information with its existing, unassailable, absolutely unmatchable monopoly in other data, would be able to then profile even more precisely in ways that we object to very strongly, ways that can go way beyond advertising, that have to do with health applications, with employment applications. The concern that was being expressed at the time, and not just by me, I did quite a lot of militant agitation about that, together with Johnny, together with others. There was a group of 15 economists advising DG Competition in matters of general antitrust, who actually signed a letter to DG Competition pointing to these particular harms. We were really concerned about the notion that bringing together the data fire hose and the health data would allow the creation of applications that was objectionable and concerning. Now, what is difficult in the public discourse is that, of course, the Commission, as we know, approved it. And the difficulty even of getting this particular point across is quite surprising to me, but it's there. Because when you talk to, for example, antitrust authorities and indeed economists, the position that tends to come back is, but why should we prevent even the dominant player from innovating in health applications? What is wrong with even a dominant player creating better matching, creating less asymmetry of information? This is the bias that we unfortunately have still in antitrust, that perfect information is always good, that we can do better things if we have more data, whereas we are in a state of the world in which these kind of basic tenets must be questioned. See, these companies have got way enough data, and giving them the opportunity to increment these data fire hose in ways and directions that go beyond advertising is incredibly dangerous. It's not what we should be doing. We should preempt and stand by a real policing of this. So, I mean, I think this is an area which is right now. And as I say, goes beyond advertising. Advertising is something we discussed again on Wednesday. Johnny Ryan is very strong on this and has provided a great deal of illustration of what the toxic tracking advertising industry is about. We know about that, and we're all kind of quite clear that that is a business model that somehow needs to be addressed. And this provision, says you can mix the data. Well, great, but the point is that these players have got already such data troves that saying that you can mix a bit more is not going to change. The problem in advertising is and tracking is more fundamental. We need to address the business model. We need to address the market power. There is more than advertising. This is my message. And in thinking about the whole range of instruments that we have, emerging to indeed the DMA, we need to think about these applications as being the really important one going forward that I think need to be policed very clearly. And I'm not convinced that this particular provision in the DMA is sufficiently precise to be clear about what we are worried about. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cristina. Actually, the inspiration for this panel I got from an article by Ruprecht Potsdam, who exactly asked the question, should gatekeepers be allowed to combine data? And he identified two problems with the current wording. First, it is not specific enough, he said, to work as a self-executable provision. And secondly, it could happen that users are nudged into giving consent easily so that the gatekeepers can continue to expand their set of personal data without user having a real say, and so on. Let's continue with Michal. Michal, you have done research also in this area, and I have mentioned your paper with Oshrit regarding the competitive advantages or disadvantages of the GDPR. How do you consider this norm? How will it affect the data processing of gatekeepers? Will it affect at all? What's your opinion on this? Please.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to contribute to this important conference. And I'm really sorry I cannot be in Berlin, but maybe another year. So I think there are a few levels that I would like to touch with regard to your question. First of all, I think that the DMA does not internalize lessons that we learned from other regulations, especially the GDPR, with regard to consent and whether it's working or not. Because if we are really concerned about data combinations, is this provision enough to prevent such combinations? And I think it's important to reiterate what we've learned so far from economic and empirical studies. So we know that users have a privacy paradox. We know that most users do not understand the implications of combining their data. Most think it only affects ads, but as Cristina has so rightly said, it goes way beyond ads. Most consumers have what we call a collective action problem here, because users do not take into account the externalities that they create on other data subjects and on market power. And here the role of the regulator is so important. And we know that there's an asymmetry of power that potentially affects the voluntariness of consent. And we also know that most users, me included, do not read the terms of sharing their data and automatically consent because you know that you're not going to change very much. We also know that that firms are masters of getting people to give consent by making it's the path of least resistance. I think about myself, there's some applications where in the beginning, I really looked carefully. But then every time that I used the service, I had to look carefully again and again and again. And so, it took so much time that I stopped doing that. We also know from the work of Campbell and Goldfarb and Tucker that users have a stronger tendency to consent to a large platform that supplies several services once they have agreed to one service that was provided by that firm. Because as they show, you say, okay, I already give some of my information to Google anyway, so I might consent to giving more. It doesn't really matter so much, rather than giving it to a new firm. We also know that most users do not change the default rules. And from my work with Oshrit Aviv, we know that the GDPR inadvertently strengthened the already strong. And 2 days ago, some mentioned the Bitkom study that 90% of the firms that were interviewed left projects because of concerns that they would not meet the GDPR. And we know that consent can sometimes even create externalities that we do not think about. For example, think about Apple, which introduced privacy-friendly and added consent to the advertising requirements there. And what happened is that their market share, Apple's market share, actually increased on its own devices. It actually tripled. And so I think that we need to take all these into account. It's not that we don't have ways around it or there are things that can be done, but putting most of our eggs on consent, I think it's extremely problematic if we actually want to achieve goals beyond maybe data sovereignty of the individual. And I think it goes back to the question of what are we trying to achieve here with limiting the combination of firms? Because it might be that, there are many different forms of power or effects that might be relevant here. Just to mention a few, think about the power to extract data from consumers. Think about infrastructural power, the power to control data flows and exclude others from collecting data. Think about the power in product and service market that relies on the data collected. Think about the power of surveillance or the power to affect conduct, the panopticon, Foucault's ideas in this regard. Think about the power to affect other spheres, such as social interactions and politics. I mean, what exactly are we trying here to prohibit? And by this limitation on data combinations. So the answer to the question of whether limiting data combination by the digital platform is the optimal solution or even a good solution may differ with regard to the different concerns that we have. So I think, the purpose has to be clear, and then the tool. And as I said, I think that the tool is currently not good enough.
Many thanks. So let's come back to the legislator. This provision has a prominent position in this article, dear Michal. Could you tell us a bit about the arguments of the gatekeepers in the legislative process, how they approach this article, this provision? And maybe then we can continue with Cristina, just a spontaneous idea. How would you, if you were in a position of legislator, how would you stipulate this prohibition that we have currently in Article 5? And maybe the same question also to Michal. Please, Michal.
Yeah, thank you. It's always a bit difficult with the two first names. So yes, we're very happy to take this up, and many thanks also to Cristina and Michal for their contributions. I think all very relevant points, and I'll try to weave in some of that here as well. Maybe first of all, in the evolution of the legislative process, well, you could see with the amendments that have been brought in from both sides, actually, that there is this recognition that what you said, Michal, we're putting all on consent. Is this a safe option? And if we do so, we have to be absolutely sure that this really works. So I think that is clearly an element that came very strongly in the process. Obviously, from the other side of the discussion, affected companies were concerned to avoid an outright ban of these type of practices, with various arguments, but obviously also pointing to potential, convenience, efficiency, and the like around this provision. And I think, again, if we're talking about directly applicable ex ante rules, I think we also think that an outright ban is disproportionate. Now, because this is a bit the question when we say, or when I hear, yes, putting everything on consent is maybe not sufficient or not effective. What is really the alternative? I think there are not so many. One is around a ban, which then maybe has to differentiate around certain scenarios, but there is not much more. And then is the other option is saying, well, if we talk about consent, how can we make this a real choice, and how can we avoid all the biases and nudging techniques that we know from the big gatekeepers? And I think there we're fully with you, that we have to ensure that this really is a real choice. Maybe just to say, I think we nevertheless have to distinguish and maybe not overload this provision, because if we are concerned that the big gatekeepers and big already data savvy companies venture into strategic sectors like health or infrastructure, energy, etc., that is maybe a completely different or additional concern, which we can have a discussion on. But I think where we expect a bit too much from the DMA and the provision 5A in particular, if we want to address these type of more strategic societal concerns, which are going beyond the more sort of economic considerations around gatekeepers and the possibility to allow third parties to compete or innovate around and within the ecosystems of these players. So I think we nevertheless have to see, if we are going beyond these objectives, then we have to also have a much broader definition. Now on the GDPR, I think there's again a choice to be made. Are we defining a different standard of consent when it comes to gatekeepers around this provision? Or are we saying, well, we have the GDPR as the fundamental framework for processing of data, which also has a lot of provisions and work around consent. And if there are deficiencies, well, we have to fix it there, because to establish specific standards for consent in different tools and in different areas may also then not really be helpful and rather create to confusion and entangling into legal discussions and litigation across across the whole economy, and also for newer companies and startups is certainly not a very helpful environment. So if we are saying we need to improve the rules around consent and we have to bring in new tools or suggestions like from Mr. Pashun around how to help consumers to make an involved choice, maybe by involving intermediaries or third parties that he calls data guides. I think then let's rather discuss around that, but then should apply sort of across the board and not only in one single instrument or in one single provision that we have in the GDPR. Thanks.
Thank you for the clarification, Michal. Cristina, if you were a legislator.
Lucky I'm not. So, I mean, I want to state one point again, very emphatically, because I think that listening to Michal talking about the arguments that the gatekeepers bring forward, I would propose not to listen to that for a moment, because, of course, I've heard 25 years of people saying that something is pro-competitive and something is efficiency enhancing when it is nothing of the sort. What we're talking about here is a situation which is a crisis. We have a privacy data protection crisis, we have a monopoly crisis, and we are here hearing that somehow if these data conflicts that already have unbeatable advantages were given the opportunity to combine yet more data, they would all beneficially work to our advantage and give us something that is good for us. The counterpoint to this is that a monopolist with perfect information will extract the surplus and will generate products from which it does benefit itself, but not us, the consumers and the citizens. So there is a fundamental point here that these arguments about efficiencies and pro-competitive developments are not believable, are not credible in the current state of the world. I think that there is a real stumbling block here, and we cannot allow ourselves to be bamboozled by these kind of efficiency stories that are absolutely counter to what is out there. Now, that said, I also have sympathy with I understand what Michal is saying in the sense that he says we can't overburden this is a provision on the DMA, we can solve all of the problems around through this, and ultimately consent is what we have. But as we just heard from Michal, consent is pretty broken in terms of a tool. I mean, we all know its limitations, and we know that it doesn't take us very far. One possibility is to be really quite perhaps explicit in the request that the GDPR requirement that processing purpose needs to be given consent for is ultimately abided by. So one could possibly, this is a suggestion I know is out there, expand somewhat the language here, making it very clear that there must be a request for each processing purpose that states the sources of the data, the result of the combination, what it is going to be intended to be used for. I realize this sounds burdensome, but I think that we need to address the notion that the track record of these players is that they've circumvented and they circumvent every single time in every single way, any sort of way to control it. So perhaps being certainly at the low level, it seems to me, just making this provision more specific and requiring that the purpose is stated very clearly for each use and consent is requested for each purpose is an important obstacle, because people would have to demonstrate that they've requested consent for that particular processing purpose and not for one other. And that consent cannot be read across different processing purposes. So that is something which at the minimum seems to me very important to pursue as a possible way to, at least in the short term, try and make this a bit more effective. Thank you.
Thank you, Cristina, for the clear words. And finally, Michal, you have the pleasure to close the session.
Well, thank you very much. And I should mention that Europe is definitely a thought and regulation leader here in this space. And, even this discussion is great. I mean, it's so important. And it's not done in all the world. It's done more and more, but partly because of what some call the Brussels effect. So I think that should be put on the table as well. One benefit of the provision of the DMA is that it limits reliance on contract. And just a week ago or so, there was a decision by the Irish Data Protection Agency that allowed Facebook to go forward based on contract and rather than consent. So the DMA is going to change that. I think that's an important point. With specifically with regard to consent, what can be done? So I think that more focus should be put on default consent rules. Okay, thinking very carefully how they should be structured, not leaving it to the companies to do it themselves. Second suggestion, I think I really like the suggestions about data guides. I think that's great. And I would even go further. I would go to group guides or group choices via data trusts, or even using an algorithm that you say, okay, in all my websites, I would like the consent to follow X, Y, Z. So the algorithm would do that for you. A bit like when you have a credit card and they already know what you the number and all the details. It might be also with regard to consent choices, and I think it can be also strengthened by more focus on how to encourage multi-homing. So interestingly, in the last year, I cannot simply type into my Gmail a search and search via Google. I need to open a new tab and go to Google, but then I can also go to other browsers. So that encourages, of course, a multi-homing. And also, I think that enforcers should also think about remedies, because the remedies, as we already heard, should not be fines. We should think outside the box here, and they should relate to data. Okay, if you took my data without my consent, if you blocked access of others to data, the remedy should be should take that into account. And finally, with regard to consent, I think it's important to invest more in what you might call digital literacy. I think that it should be done from a very young age, and people should understand what consent actually means. And I heard that there's a European package with regard to digitization. I think that should be part of it. And another point I want to make is that, of course, we should look at this from a holistic point of view. And I think that the effectiveness of Section 51A cannot be assessed as a standalone. And I think that here, it's more important to create better mechanisms for ensuring that we can overcome these data-based incumbency advantages, so that in 10 years we are not in the same space. So some things to think about in this regard. First of all, I think that data sharing here is extremely important, but I think that the DMA does a little too little, too late. And let me give you a few pointers here in how they might be changed. For example, each business user can gain access only to a small part of the data which is potentially available, that part that pertains to him. And if he wants to combine it together with data from other business users, you have to again gain the consent of the user, of the data subject. So that means that even these provisions with regard to sharing are not going to be able to create large troves of data for most of the firms that will gain access through them. Another point is with regard to interoperability and portability of data, because although Section 6H mandates gatekeepers to provide tools for end users to facilitate the exchange of data portability, this is not enough, because as I've shown in my work with Dan Rubenfeld, the devil is in the details, and if you leave it to the gatekeepers, it would probably not be the optimal level or usage of interoperability and portability standards for the industry.
Thank you.
And
thank you, Michal. We have to keep. If it's your final remark, please go on, because we have to keep in mind that we have a following session and we have to continue the program and the break.
Definitely. I'm getting to my final remark, which is the global dynamic. I think that in any regulation, thought should be given to how that affects other jurisdictions. I think it's important to work together with our other jurisdictions and maybe try to convince them to adopt relatively similar regulations, because if Europe does it on its own, it might have different effects that should be taken into account. Thank you.
I really appreciate your words. Let's say during the French presidency, finally the DMA will be adopted, and let's say 6 months later enters into force. So maybe we'll have an opportunity in the near future to discuss the effects again with you and to see who was right or who was wrong. But hopefully this article will work. Dear Michal, I really congratulate to you and to your colleagues for the great work you have done in the last years. And let's hope that the DMA will be success and will create the effects that we all expect. Many thanks to all of you. Best wishes to London, Haifa, and Luxembourg. Many thanks.
Thank you. Bye-bye.